Alright, this is my Cold War video project, and we're going to be covering relationship between communist and democratic countries after the Second World War in the context of the following. Expansionism, containment, detente and brinksmanship, proxy wars and liberation movements, and deterrence and espionage, as long as not non-alignment. Expansionism versus containment. Expansionism was a political military policy of taking over additional territory for the violation of another country's sovereignty for reasons that can include defense, access to resources or markets, national pride, or perceived racial superiority. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union was now in charge of Eastern Europe. They extended their influence and set up communist puppet governments as a buffer zone between them and the West. Containment. The U.S. Cold War foreign policy of stopping the spread of communism by establishing strategic allies around the world through trade and military alliances. An example of this was when the U.S. deployed troops to Korea and Vietnam to help the democratic capitalist governments fight the communist governments. Detente versus brinksmanship. Detente was a period from the Cold War from the mid-1960s to 1979, during which major powers tried to lessen tensions between them through diplomacy, treaties, arms stocks, and reductions in cultural exchanges. The Soviet Union and the U.S. signed a series of arms reduction treaties through the strategic arms limitation talks in order to ease emotions after close encounters of war. Brinksmanship was the opposite of this. Was international behavior or foreign policy that takes a country to the brink of war, pushing one's demand to the point of any military action. In October 1962, the world was exclusively onto nuclear warfare. The U.S. discovered that Soviet mid-range nuclear missiles were stationed in Cuba, just off the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy imposed a blockade to prevent any more Soviet missiles from arriving at the island. He used brinksmanship, and he was willing to use military action to prevent Soviet missiles being stationed off the Florida coast. After a few tense days of standoff, the deal was negotiated and then missiles left the island. Deterrence and espionage. Deterrence was the Cold War foreign policy of both major powers, aiming to deter military advances of the other through developing and building up arms, especially nuclear weapons. Deterrence depended on each side creating a perception that was willing to use its weapons. The U.S. and Soviet Union were constantly trying to one-up each other by increasing the amount of bombs they created. At the height of the Cold War, the USSR had up to 40,000 nuclear bombs in its arsenal. Espionage, the practice of using military spies to obtain political and military information. Famous cases of this was when the Soviet Union used spies to steal American nuclear secrets to catch up in the nuclear arms race, and when they turned CIA officer Aldrich Ames to a double agent in order to spy on the U.S. Non-alignment. Non-alignment was a position taken during the Cold War by those members of the UN, mostly developing countries, did not sign the U.S. or USSR. For example, in Africa, a lot of countries did not explicitly pledge allegiance to either side. Social aspects compared communist and democratic capitalist countries. In communist countries, healthcare was free and usually with lower quality and long waiting periods, while in democratic capitalist countries, it was a combination of public and private, usually of higher quality. Education was free, including post-secondary under the USSR, while in democratic was free up to high school. In most countries, you had to pay for post-secondary. In communism, they were striving towards one class of society or a classless society, while in democratic capitalism, there was the lower, upper, and middle class. Media in the communist countries were publicly funded and controlled by the government, while under democratic capitalism, there was mostly private and independent media, but there was some publicly funded media. Under communism, you officially did have freedoms, such as freedom of speech, religion, assembly, but in practice, all three were limited. While under democratic capitalist countries, freedom of speech, religion, assembly were all guaranteed by law. Economic aspects compared. Sources of income. In the USSR, everyone worked, and investments from work are not allowed. Then nobody made that much, but in the democratic capitalist countries, you can make as much as you want, depending on how hard you work or how smart you work, and you can invest your money. Private ownership was not legal in communism. The means of production, land, factory equipment all belonged to the state, while in democratic capitalism, you can own anything you want. Under communism, there was no competition. All aspects of the economy were produced and controlled centrally, while economy in democratic capitalist countries was based on the free market and characterized by competition. Under communism, there was full employment. Everyone had the right to work, and it was guaranteed by law. While under democratic capitalism, there was always a little bit of unemployment, as nobody was guaranteed work yet to find it. Standard of living in communism was fairly medium to low. Typically, basic food and shelter were provided, but that's about all you got. While under democratic capitalism, it was low to high, because depending on how hard you work or how much you had, you could live a very good life, a very poor one. Political aspects: under communism, there was a one-party system with one person in charge. Under democratic capitalism, there was multi-party systems, often governed by coalitions. Under communism, there was absolutely no opposition. Under democratic, there was frequent and lots of opposition. Under communism, there was no rule of law by standards of democratic countries. Only the law was interpreted by one person. There was no defined set of laws that they had to follow. Democratic capitalism, there was a strong rule of law. Under communism, there was one person in charge for many, many years, almost like a dictatorship, while under democratic capitalism, there was a frequent change of governments with different leaders.